All right, it's already 8:01, so we'll be starting. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here at this presentation of our by the Global Sustainable Electricity Partnership. Sorry, at the launch of our report that we call the GEM. So my name is Vincent-Michel Duval. I'm the executive director of GSEP, and for those who are not as familiar with us, the Global Sustainable Electricity Partnership, or in short, GSEP, is an international organization which is composed of some of the largest electricity company in the world, and we have a mission to accelerate the decarbonization of our economies through electrification of end use. As you may know, to reach IEA net zero scenario, electric utilities, we need to multiply the generation capacity as well as decarbonizing our grid. It's a great challenge, to say the least, a challenge that GSEP and its members are working at every day to make this a reality as rapidly as possible. So to do so, we've launched the GEM. So the Global Electrification Monitor is our flagship report. It tracks the pace of electrification around the world in some of the largest markets. As you will see in this presentation today, it gives also an optimistic view of the future with the space for action, and also by identifying the exact areas where progress is possible. So in order to guide us through this Global Electrification Monitor report, I have the pleasure to introduce to you Marco Baroni. Marco is an energy expert, consultant, and a lecturer at the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, Sciences Po. Marco has 20 years of broadly varied work experience in the energy field, acquired at the IEA and working with European electric utilities. At the IEA, he co-authored 11 editions of the World Energy Outlook. So, Marco, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for guiding us through a Global Electrification Monitor.
Thank you very much, Vincent. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And today we will be just going through the main outcomes, the main messages that really are underlying our analysis in the Global Electrification Monitor in the 2023 edition. So, as mentioned, the GEM is the Global Electrification Monitor, or GEM, is at its second edition, is looking at global trends, but also in depth at 15 countries that account for about 2/3 of global final energy demand and about 70% of global electricity demand. And we look in details at a number of different indicators, as we are convinced that one indicator or a few indicators don't tell the entire story. Of course, there are some overarching indicators which are very important, but there are some sectoral ones, some more detailed ones that are very, we think, are very useful and are provided in detail in the report. This year we are presenting the trends till 2020. Why 2020? Because 2020 is the last year of complete available energy balances. So each year, one additional year is added to the new GEM, and this year the 2023 edition is divided actually in two different parts. The first part continues looking at the evolution of the indicators, the 2021 as we mentioned, and the second part looks at the effects of the global energy crisis. So the rising prices up till and including 2022, and we analyzed what were the effects of the energy crisis in the different countries of the world, with some specific in-depths that we will come back onto. So when we're talking about global indicators, as I mentioned, there are many indicators to look at. The one indicator that often is looked at to summarize electrification is the share of electricity in total final demand. Well, if we look at that indicator for 2020, the signal at the first glance is very good because and there was an acceleration in the electrification of in the global electrification of final users that was more or less 4 times higher than the average of the previous decade. So a very steep acceleration in 2020. We looked, though, a little bit more in depth. Well, we looked a lot more in depth at the different reasons and at the different sectors, and we realized some, unfortunately, less encouraging signals. First, if we look at still the global level and still at the total final consumption level, well, already we realized that this big increase was mainly due to the decreasing energy demand, and in particular to the decreasing energy demand in transport, mainly for oil, due to the effects of the COVID-19. So, at the first sight, very encouraging, very big increase, but in reality, this was mainly due not to a higher electrification of the system, but rather the fact that electrification was that electricity demand was more, if you want, resilient, was decreased less than other fuel sources, in particular oil and transport. So we then looked at what the effect was in the different sectors, and looking at the different sectors, this big increase, this 0.8%, which sounds like a minor thing, but it would be a huge increase if every year we could increase by 0.81% per year. We could get close to the IEA net zero emissions scenario by 2050. Well, in reality, already when we look at each different sector, well, the increase was very limited. 0.1 in buildings, 0.16% in transport, and even lower levels in industry. Why all of this? Well, as we said, this was really due to the decreasing overall demand, and often, almost everywhere, the decrease also of electricity demand, with some few good exceptions. In buildings, the residential sector that increased, where electricity demand increased in absolute levels, more or less counterbalancing the big decrease in the services sector. And in transport, more or less a stable electricity demand, mainly supported by an increase in China. So in both cases, we could see that the development was moderate in both buildings and transport due to these two elements. But surely the decrease of oil demand in transport had this overall effect of decreasing total demand and therefore increasing the share, as we've seen in the previous slide. This small increase was somehow disappointing when we looked by sector. Why is that? Because with a little change in each sector at the global level, and yet an even more ambitious target in the World Energy Outlook 2022 net zero emission scenario, well, we are confronted with the problem that the increase in each scenario was marginal, while the target is even more ambitious in each one of the sectors. So we have been analyzing the space for action. So if you prefer, the potential in each sector, in each country of each one of the 15 countries that we analyzed in depth, looking at where the starting point is in each sector, what is where are the other low carbon where is the what is the space occupied by the other low carbon sources, how much is in the hard to abate sectors, how much energy consumption is in those sectors, and therefore of the remaining potential, how much do we need to accelerate in each to increase in each sector? And the answer is there is still a lot of there is an enormous actually amount of potential in each sector, in each country that is still untapped, and urgent action is really needed to be put in place because we really need to use that potential, to use that space for action as quickly as we can to be able to reach the goals set in the net zero emission scenario. This is a very important other set of indicators that are presented in the report. On top of the electrification in total and by sector, the potential, another very important indicator, of course, is we want to electrify end uses. Well, we want at the same time to decarbonize electricity generation. So when we want to decarbonize electricity generation and we look at the past decade till 2019, we see that the global power generation sector has been decreasing its emissions by about slightly more than 1% per year, with a higher decrease of many important countries around the world, almost minus 2% per year in China, in between 3 and 4% in a number of other countries. What happened in 2019? Similar to the increase in electrification in end uses, well, we could see an acceleration in most countries. This acceleration was a very encouraging signal. And it is more encouraging, if you want, than the situation of the electrification, in the sense that this was the effect, on one side, yes, of decreasing electricity generation, as electricity demand decreased over time. Also, electricity generation decreased from 2019 to 2020, but also to the fact that low carbon generation globally increased. So the increasing the share of low carbon generation in all countries and in at the global level brought emissions to decrease. Can this be expected to continue over time? Well, to be honest, what we expect and what we have seen from several in several countries from 2021 and 2022 data is in some cases a rebound up. For example, in Germany, to highlight the one that decreased the most, as electricity generation goes back to original to previous levels of demand, and you need to use fossil fuel generation to cover up for that difference. So we expect in 2021 and 22 a rebound in some countries up, which needs instead to be compared at a global level with a decrease in the two main scenarios, decarbonization scenarios of the IEA, the APS and the net zero emission scenario, which require an acceleration of the pace of reduction at the global level by a factor 4 to 8 times. So what is the lesson learned here? Very good till 2019, nice acceleration in 2020. We can expect some difficulties in 2021 and 2022 unless there is a very big acceleration of low carbon, of the deployment of low carbon sources, so renewables and nuclear and nuclear generation in particular. But all of this still falls short of the very high ambitions, of the very high needs that we have to reach the net zero emission scenario in particular. So a word of that is encouraging in this case, but also a word of caution when going forward. Much more urgent action must be put in place. Policies must be put in place to be able to reach this goal. I would then like to move on to the second part. So the analysis of the impact of the energy crisis, so of the big increases in energy prices that we have seen in electricity, in gas, in oil products. We have analyzed all of these four, in particular for the 15 countries analyzed in the report, with some exceptions where data were not available, but in the vast majority of the countries analyzed in the report, in particular for electricity and natural gas, but also for oil products. We will come back to that in the coming slides. When looking at the different effects, we realized that, well, as many people can expect, the biggest impact of the energy crisis, the impact was felt in many countries of the world, if not in almost all countries in the world. But the crisis was in the end felt much more in Europe, where the reference gas price increased almost eightfold from 2019 to 2022, and in real terms, electricity wholesale prices that increased by a factor 6, 7, depending on the country. So a really big increase of prices that did put in question the competitiveness of the industries, of businesses in general, and the ability of households to sustain, so the impact, so the affordability of this of energy in households. These increases were absorbed in particular by households, by electricity producing companies in certain cases. This is the example, for example, also of Japan. Europe was not the only, of course, place where this happened. Japan had a big impact as well. Here in the slide, we can see the change in residential electricity prices, in electricity and gas prices, but from 2019 to 2022. And we can see how Japan was affected very much as well. So this increase was absorbed, as I mentioned, by households directly, by electricity producing companies, and in particular in Europe, by government through support measures. We analyzed a lot the support measures, which were very important to be taken into account through the as a counter effect to this situation. And I will come back on this in the next slides. So here we can see how the reduction of energy taxation was a very big one of the main levers that governments used to absorb the impact of the increase in energy prices. Well, the big levers were the limiting the increase of tariffs, were reducing the energy taxation levies and so on, and providing direct vouchers, grants, one payment to the lower income households. There were, of course, a number of other type of measures, but these three were the three main categories. In the case of the reduction of taxes, we can see how this did temper the increase a lot. We can see it in France, in Germany, in Italy, the gray areas, the gray parts of the stacks, but also for gas, for example. This had a very beneficial effect for households, lowering the impact, and also for businesses. We, of course, conducted this analysis for both households and businesses, reducing the impact of the increase, but also reducing the gap between electricity and gas prices. So reducing the level of tax, the different taxation between the two, and contributing also in some way to move towards a more level playing field among the different energy sources. This limiting factor on energy taxes, but also all the other government measures, all the other measures to limit the increase of energy prices, resulted in a very important result on the affordability of households. If we measure, and we did, of course, the effect, the impact of the increase of prices in electricity, gas, and oil bills in a number of countries from 2019 to 2022 in real terms, we can see how the increase was pretty significant, about 1/3 in Germany, for example, in Italy or in Spain, thanks to the subsidies. We have also looked at what would have been the impact without the subsidies, and we could see for in the different European countries, in France, in Germany, in Spain, and Italy are the four that we analyze, the four European countries that we are analyzed in our report, that the share of that the average energy expenditure as a share of household expenditure would have doubled if no government subsidies had been put in place. What would have this mean? Well, that this would have had very big repercussions. Already they did, but it would have been way worse without these helps to the overall affordability of households and to the overall economy of the different countries. Of course, there are ways to when we look at the increase of prices, we also have to look at what were the effects on the different technologies that are being used in end use by end users. And when we look, of course, at the use of efficient electricity-based technologies, the obvious two examples come to mind, heat pumps and electric vehicles, we can see in both cases how the increase of prices were much more the increase was much lower in the case of energy efficient technologies, so for heat pumps and for electricity prices. This, of course, for the variable part cost of the technologies. It remains an open question. It remains a very important point. The need of the upfront of the high upfront investment cost. So the additional being able to invest in these technologies when you are already under strain because the affordability has worsened, as we saw in the previous slide, is not easy, in particular for the lower income families. And therefore, this is another very crucial point where government policies will really continue to play a vital role for the deployment, for the further deployment of these efficient technologies. Really, heat pumps and electric vehicles being the most important ones, but of course not the only ones. But these really require a very high upfront investment costs. With this, I would like to stop, just remind the few main messages, and leave the floor to our chat, because I think we will have Q&As that are going to be interesting. It's always interesting to have the possibility of discuss these points. So the key takeaways. First, as we saw in 2020, it looked the overall indicators seemed to be encouraging, but in reality they were caused rather by the exceptional conditions caused by COVID-19 rather than by a real further electrification. To be able to reach the net zero goals, the Paris Agreement goals, really a big acceleration needs to be put in place. And in particular, the space for action remains underutilized, and therefore urgent action is really needed to unlock it in the next years. I want to really give this feeling of urgency. We cannot wait years. This really needs to be done in these years, in the coming years. When we look at the energy crisis, well, the energy crisis had really unprecedented increases in a number of countries, with some countries, in particular European ones, putting in place massive subsidies. For 2022, we estimated just for the four European countries that we mentioned, about $400 billion that were put in place for supporting families and households and businesses. If we look at the lessons learned, well, for sure, the use of efficient, if we look at the affordability, affordability needs to be addressed. Competitiveness is very important for the sustainability of industries, and the lessons learned really can enhance the further electrification, in particular through energy efficient electricity-based technologies. And the last point, which is very important, is remembering how the further electrification has a number of wide-ranging benefits, including, of course, greater efficiency of the energy system and energy security of the whole of each country. With this, I would like to stop. Thank you for the attention, and give back the floor, and we are surely open for questions.
So, Marco, I have first question for you that I received. So, you mentioned that the reduction in taxation helped level the playing field between electricity and gas. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how maintaining this level playing field will be key to continue promoting electrification beyond the energy crisis?
That is an excellent question. I will go back, if you allow me, to the slide, because I think there are several points to be taken from this slide. This was the action on energy, on electricity, and in general on energy taxes, reducing them was a very first important way that that governments could put in place to quickly alleviate the burden. So in terms of effectiveness, it was great. In terms of long-term impact on the competitiveness of electricity versus other fuels, in particular fossil fuels, it is a great step forward. There is one thing, though, that we need to remember: reducing taxes doesn't come at is not a measure without cost. So those additional, those missing revenues for the state, for the governments, need to be balanced by other incomes. So this needs to be put in place in a very well thought framework policy to be able to adapt to mark this evolution. But surely I think that going towards a more level playing field among different fuels is going to be very important. So if you want, I see a very big difference between the short term, the medium and long term. The medium to long term really needs to evolve towards this to be able to promote also to allow the additional electrification, because in the end, this is what is not only in the net zero emission scenario. All the big scenarios that look at the decarbonization of the energy system have very high levels of electrification, and promoting the competitiveness of electricity solutions is one of the most important actions to take.
Oh, thank you, Marco. I have another question for you, but I also like to remind that all the participants that if they wish to ask more questions, they can write them on the chat, and we'll ask them to our expert Marco. Thank you for answering those questions, Marcos. It's very, very interesting. Another question for you is that we saw in one of your graphs that the European rates of electricity increased a lot more significantly than in the US, Canada, or even other states. So, I mean, how do you explain that? Why is there such a huge difference? I mean, it was a global energy crisis, but yeah, what's your perspective on that?
Um, well, of course, the impact is different when we're talking about electricity or natural gas. Electricity, by its own nature, is a more local commodity. Natural gas is much more um, internationalized. I'm not sure if that word is correct. My apologies. Through the LNG trade. Of course, LNG trade though doesn't cover the entirety um, of uh, um, of electricity um, generation. So the balance between demand and supply is not covered completely by that. If there was an unlimited amount of LNG possibility, then we could see the two converging. Because this is not the case, of course, there was not a complete convergence. So if you want, my first reaction would be, for what concerns natural gas, the biggest increase in Europe and in Japan, it's simply due to the higher exposure to imports. In the case of North America, is much more to the link is much more through exports. So of course, the prices increase, but do not increase to the same level. Europe, in particular, having the big loss of imports from Russia. Electricity was a little bit of a consequence of this situation of gas that, though, depended in each. I prefer to call them power systems rather than countries or states. In each power system, it depends on the share of gas, on the importance of gas in the electricity production mix. I would think that these are the two main reasons. Then we could discuss about market rules, how this is passed on. I mean, there is much more, but these are, I would say, the two main characteristics.
Oh, thank you so much. It's very interesting to get your perspective on these important elements. In the space for action graph that you showed during the presentation, so we saw that the space for action is quite significant. And in order to reach the IEA net zero or APS target, it's there's a lot that we can be done. So can you maybe do you have, what's your opinion? Which sector, which area are probably the most promising, so that we can electrify as quickly as possible?
I think that there is a lot of potential in all of the sectors. So I wouldn't stop to one sector. I would try to tackle the each sector to the highest extent possible. Exactly because we are in a hurry, meaning we want to accelerate the electrification and the decarbonization of the energy sector really rapidly, but also because there is not one solution that will solve the problem. If you want, in some ways, it's somehow easier to to electrify buildings where you have more solutions, you are more used to it, you have a lot of the right conditions in place, rather than transport where oil is dominant and where to have a higher electrification, for example, of electric vehicles, this needs to be really pushed through very good and dedicated um, uh, policy actions, which is directed at the demand, so at the sales of electric vehicles, which is happening at the moment, but on the other side, also on the infrastructure to support this development, because we always have to remember that the energy sector is very complex, that is very interconnected, and we cannot push one part without at the same time pushing the other part. In this case, infrastructure, we believe in reality, because we have been discussing this very often, the importance of infrastructure, of the overall electricity infrastructure, but also of the other infrastructures like the supporting infrastructure for mobility, so for electric vehicles, is extremely important. And the coordination of this infrastructure among them, so between, for example, electricity and the recharging and the deployment of electric vehicles, all of that requires a very careful, a very important coordination. So my answer would be in general something maybe too simple, but everywhere. Push it, push it, push it.
All right. And what about the hard to abate sector? How do we tackle that?
The hard to abate, well, by its own definition, they are hard to abate. But of course, there is a lot of discussion, a lot of talk, a lot of hope on the development of hydrogen. Now, hydrogen can be seen we're talking about hydrogen, of course, low carbon hydrogen. So hydrogen produced from low carbon sources, otherwise it would not be useful. And because the majority of these sources would be low carbon electricity, that is considered by most countries, then we could even think of hydrogen as being a secondary electricity, so a further source of electrification. How much of the penetration in the mix of hydrogen we will be able to reach in the different countries, to me is still a little bit more uncertain than the potential that we have for electricity in the space for action. With this, it's not that I am not positive about the possible development, all of the contrary, but there's still a lot of push to be put in place. When I'm saying push, means policies to be put in place for the development of hydrogen generation and demand to be able, in the end, to reach, in particular, those hard-to-abate sectors.
Thank you so much. Another question from the chat, and I encourage all the people online to ask some other question if you wish. An probably easier one. So how did we select the 15 countries? Why these 15 countries and not other ones?
Well, as we mentioned, in some cases, many of them are some obvious choices. You cannot make you can do what you want in an analysis, but it's more representative when you have big actors included in the analysis. So how did we choose them? The vast majority of them are big actors. In fact, as we said at the beginning, 70% of the analysis of the countries covered by the analysis, 70% of energy demand is in those 15 countries. So that is a first obvious answer. There is, of course, also the will to look at more in specific at certain countries. I will not deny that, of course, having GSEP member countries was another obvious choice. I think you will you will tell me rather than I tell you.
Well, it was really the main point was to cover as much as possible in terms of energy consumption. So 70% of global electricity use and 62/3 of global energy consumption was the idea of covering those 16 countries. Um, Maybe another question related to the space for action, maybe or not. Well, I mean, we've discussed about the space for action and pull of space there. What we've discussed a little bit less is the decarbonization of the power generation side of things, where we need as well, Marco, to accelerate as much as possible on that front. So is the potential there also underutilized? How do we go about with accelerating as well the generation side, as it's going to be critical in order to electrify it as well, electrify those end uses that we've discussed. So, yeah.
The answer here really is if the answer is very differentiated by country in the different sectors for electrification, it's even more so for power generation, because it's undeniable that certain countries have a much higher renewable potential, for example, than others, and therefore have the ability of using that potential. I wouldn't say in an easier way, but still the potential is there. So it's more available. They face different problems. The rebound effect, to say one, because if prices are too low, then there is a tendency of not using wisely and efficiently the energy. For how to cope with the additional demand that will come from the electrification of the sector. So there are significant problems also in the countries that are endowed with the big renewable potentials. But on the other side, I would say the potential has been used in terms of renewable potential has been used differently at different levels in different countries. So there is surely still a lot of potential to be used and therefore to decarbonize. But it still requires an acceleration. It requires an acceleration in particular for the mix of technologies, of low carbon technologies, in the countries, in particular, that want to include nuclear among the low carbon technologies to be developed. The question for me is, are you doing things with the right mix of quick and cautious, meaning developing strategies that are very well developed and have a very good foresight to the future, and that can be implemented quickly enough. In the end, I think that the mix of technologies, of low carbon technologies, depends on the will of each country, on the availability and potential of each country. More needs to be done in the sense that we need to accelerate, as we can see in this graph. We need really to accelerate more and more. In particular, in a world where we want to keep increasing electricity demand.
Yeah.
Because it's not just with today's electricity demand. Is a world where we want to keep increasing to be able to decarbonize better the end use sectors. Sorry for the long answers.
No, and I think we could discuss this subject for hours and
yes,
going into the energy security aspects of things and all of that. But I think we've went through all the questions that we had on the chat. Thank you for accepting to answering those. So maybe to wrap up this conversation, well, first of all, thank you, Marco, for this great presentation, for giving us the insight on the state of electrification. Giving us also an overview and of the government and have they acted to lessen the impact of the crisis. I think these were great lessons that we've seen there, and then we can project ourselves with these actions to further accelerate the electrification of end use. And also showing that there is plenty space for action to accelerate further, and the access of collaboration between utilities, power utilities, government, stakeholder, the value chains are going to be key in order to continue accelerating that. So I would like to thank you all for attending this event. I'd like to encourage you to share this report with your colleagues on social media. We'll also like to invite you to continue following us on LinkedIn. So on behalf of GSEP and all its members, it was a pleasure to host you this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for being here, and it will be a pleasure to answer more questions should you have them. Please feel free to reach out on social media with us. Thank you so much. I wish you a pleasant day, and see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.